everybody. I'm just going to wait another minute or two to allow additional people to join on, and then we'll get started, okay? Hello, everybody. I'm Judy Aronchik, and on the behalf of the Executive Council of ASAF, I want to welcome you to our very first virtual ASAF luncheon meeting, and I would like to emphasize the first. We are hoping for a glitch-free 1 hour, but if not, bear with us. I hope you're enjoying your virtual lunches, and your mics should all be muted, and we will give you an opportunity to speak later. Before we meet today's speaker, I just want to tell you about 2 upcoming lectures sponsored by the Executive Council of ASAF. In 2 weeks on November 11th, Dr. George Dallenberg, Dr. Jessica Fowler, and Dr. Iris Reyes will speak to us about the work being done by the Alliance of Minority Physicians at the Perelman School of Medicine. That talk is entitled Finding Strength Through Diversity, the Alliance of Minority Physicians. And then on December 3rd, Dr. Eileen Rosen, who is a sleep expert in the pulmonary division, will speak on sleep deprivation in healthcare. And now it is a pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Anjan Chatterjee. Dr. Chatterjee is professor of neurology, psychology, and architecture, and he is the founding director of the Penn Center for Neuroaesthetics. He is a member of the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience, as well as the Center for Neuroscience and Society at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Chatterjee is the past chair of neurology at Pennsylvania Hospital. His research explores the areas of neuroaesthetics, spatial cognition and language, and neuroethics. He has been on the editorial boards of numerous scientific and neuroscience journals, and he has received awards from the American Academy of Neurology, as well as the American Psychological Association, for his contributions to behavioral and cognitive neurology, and for his contributions to psychology and the arts. He is well known for his book, The Aesthetic Brain, How We Evolved to Desire Beauty and Enjoy Art, and he will be speaking on this topic today. And I'm really looking forward to Dr. Chatterjee's explanation for why my brain thinks that Claude Monet's water lilies are magnificent, but I am not a real big fan of the Mona Lisa. And here's Dr. Anjan Chatterjee.
Thank you very much. And just to lower expectations, I probably won't answer that question. But let me, in hopes for a glitch-free presentation, let me see if I can figure out sharing my slides. So let's see. All right, so one question is, are you seeing the presenter mode or the presentation mode? Like, are you seeing one slide? Because in the past, I've had problems with this on Zoom calls.
We see the one slide.
Ah, perfect, okay. So thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. I did not realize I was the inaugural Zoom talker here. So 2 years ago, with the support of the Department of Neurology, the School of Medicine, the Center for Human Appearance, and the Provost's office, I initiated the Penn Center for Neuroaesthetics. It is the first research center of its kind in the country, possibly the world, but I'm less sure about that. And just as a plug for Penn, it perhaps speaks to Penn's willingness to invest in what might be regarded as a risky scientific venture. And to emphasize that point, here is a PubMed search on neuroaesthetics, and you can see that this is a very, very young field, that it is barely 20 years old, and really it's only in the last 10 to 12 years that there has been an acceleration in publications in this domain. So just to give you a sense of what a young field this actually is. In thinking about aesthetic experiences, which is a big, baggy, complicated area, we kind of use this general framework that can actually be applied to any kind of human experience, but in the context of aesthetic experiences, we think of this as an emergent quality of interactions of several large-scale systems in several large-scale psychological and brain systems. So those include the design of our sensory and motor systems, how that constrains what it is that we apprehend and how we experience them, how those are related to our valuation systems. So how do we decide that we like something? How is this related to the reward systems in our brain? And then on top of that, our personal experiences, our backgrounds, our education, the particular culture in which we find ourselves, how does that have an influence? How does that modulate these aesthetic experiences that are perhaps grounded in our sensory motor systems and our valuation systems? So with that as a kind of broad overview, what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about the kinds of questions we are exploring in my center. And this will be, you can think of it as almost a sort of tasting menu of things we're doing as opposed to one coherent narrative arc. So one way we approach this is through the visual system. Arguably, one can have aesthetic experiences through every sensory modality. Certainly audition and music is a very powerful set of experiences, but it can be through taste and smell and touch. But we have chosen to focus programmatically on the visual system. And one way of thinking about the visual system is our occipital cortex, our visual system carves out the world broadly into people, places, and things. And so we are interested in some of the aesthetic experiences of people, places, and things. And within that, there are broad overarching themes that we are interested in. So with people, one can start with the question about facial beauty. When we think about beauty, most people typically or prototypically will think about a face. And so we have been interested in what is the nature of our neural response to beauty and faces. And to give you an example of an early study we did, this was published in 2009. This is an fMRI study. People came into the lab and into the scanner, and they were shown a series of faces. These are computer-generated faces, so they don't actually belong to a real person out there in the world. And they came in 2 sessions. In one session, they made a judgment about beauty, which is whether they thought a face was more beautiful than a previous face. And in another session, they made a judgment of identity, which is, did they see this face before or not, right? So in one case, a beauty judgment is being made explicitly. In the other, they're strictly saying, have I seen this face before or not? So that's the basic setup. What do we find? So these are the fMRI results being shown, and I'm just going to focus on the bottom panel. For those of you who are not used to looking at these kinds of images, what we are looking at in the bottom panel is looking from underneath the brain. So this is the ventral, the bottom surface of the brain. And what is at the lower end of the screen is our occipital cortex. So that's where visual information comes in. What's at the top of that panel is the front of the brain around where our forehead is. So on the left, in the parts of our visual system that is depicted in blue, yellow, and red, is a depiction of the functional specialization that occurs in visual cortex. So the red area are parts of the brain that are responsive to places. It can be either landscapes or architectural spaces. The yellow is within the fusiform gyrus. This is an area that seems to be preferentially responsive to faces. And the blue area is referred to sometimes as the lateral occipital complex. That is an area that is responsive to objects more than scrambled kind of images. So if we look at the middle of the bottom panel, what we are showing is that within occipital cortex, the neural activity shown there varies with how attractive the faces are, right? So that's basically what is being shown. The data are being modeled by how attractive the faces are, and we see in visual cortex, there is this increased neural activity. It's not a generalized effect because in parts of the brain that are responsive to places, shown in red on the adjacent panel, is not actually activated by this. So there seems to be some specificity to this. And then there are other parts of frontal and parietal cortex that are also activated in this condition when people are actually making beauty judgments. So it's worth pausing there for a minute and pointing out that this is not how it necessarily had to turn out. For example, if I told you that the design of the brain was that the back of the brain, our visual system, categorized the world, and the front of our brain, where many of our emotional systems and our reward systems and deep in the brain where emotional systems reside, actually did the valuation, that would seem like a perfectly plausible way the brain might be designed. But this suggests that quite early in visual cortex that there is some modulation, some valuation that is occurring on these visual stimuli. In some ways, what was at least, if not more interesting, is what's shown on the right panel, which is that when people are making an identity judgment, so there is nothing explicit in this condition where they're lying in the scanner and being asked to think about beauty. They're just saying, did I see this person or not? We get the same kind of response in visual cortex, which is our visual cortex or the visual cortex of the participants were varying parametrically with how attractive the faces were, even though they were not being asked a question about beauty. So one implication of this is that our brains are always responding to beauty, at least in the case of faces. Whether this is true for other objects, we just don't know. And it suggests a kind of automaticity to our response to beauty. So in a more recent study, we asked a question about this automaticity to say, is this somehow expressed bodily? So is this expressed in how we act, how we behave? And this is a very simple experiment that I did with some collaborators at Singapore. So the basic experiment is you start out with the mouse at the bottom number, in this case 41, and people are asked to move their mouse to whichever number at the top left or top right is closer to the bottom number. Very easy task. People have no trouble doing it. The trick of the experiment is the faces that are adjacent to these numbers are completely irrelevant to the task. They have nothing to do with the task, they're just there, but they vary in how attractive they are, and those were all normed to assess how attractive they were deemed. And these are all in the range of kind of normal looking people, right? We're not testing, we don't have stimuli of supermodels, for example, right? But what we find is that in this group of participants, if the attractive face is in the location that is the distractor location, right? So it's not the number to which they have to move their mouse. People's limbs move gradually towards the attractive face before it lands on the right number. And people are unaware that they're doing this, but the implication of this is that attraction, in this case, is not simply a metaphor, that there is really something about our motor systems that are drawn towards an attractive face before it lands on the right number. Okay. So if there are these automatic responses to beauty, both in terms of what's happening in our brain and how that gets expressed in our motor system, are there any broader implications of this as a phenomena? And we got interested in something that social psychologists have described a fair amount, which is that there appears to be a beauty is good stereotype, which is that people who are regarded as attractive are also regarded as being good, that there is a conflation of looking good with being good. And this shows up in a variety of ways, which is attractive people tend to be hired more easily than people who are less attractive. Attractive people are given more, are typically given higher wages. If they commit crimes, they are given lesser punishments. And so in the catalog of unearned privileges, being attractive turns out to be one of them that doesn't get talked about very much. With this in mind, we took a slightly different take on this, which is asking the question of if people have facial anomalies, and some of this work was in part supported by the Center for Human Appearance here at Penn, where people are, a number of the members of the center are surgeons, where these kinds of facial anomalies are surgically corrected. So in this study, we combed several surgical texts to come up with a series of faces where we had both before and after images of people that had had surgical corrections of their relatively minor facial anomalies. So these can be skin cancers, they can be scars, they can be birthmarks. And this was an online study. And what we find is that without realizing it, people make these kinds of negative character attributes to people if they have minor facial anomalies, which is they think of them as being less competent, less intelligent, less hardworking, less confident, less trustworthy, and so on. We followed up on that study, but before I get to that, it's just worth pointing out that this idea that people with facial anomalies have negative personal characteristics, this mistaken idea is something that popular media capitalizes on considerably. So you can see how often in popular movies, whether it's Bond villains or Marvel villains, or even children's movies like The Lion King, often what is depicted as someone with an anomalous face, a flawed face is regarded as a flawed character. And that way, filmmakers don't have to develop a big backstory on why the person is bad. The audience presumably knows this right away. But it was also worth pointing out that this is a message we are giving to kids as young as 3 to 4 years old that are going and seeing movies like The Lion King. So in following up on this observation, what we have also found is that when we apply the implicit association test, so this is something that many of you are probably familiar with, especially since Penn is doing this big push on implicit bias right now, this idea that if you associate a certain kind of face with certain words that are negatively valenced, that is one way to assess if people have negative biases. And this has certainly been done in race studies. It's also been done in gender studies. And we started to look at this with these kinds of facial anomalies. And sure enough, what we find is that people do have quite robust negative implicit biases against these kinds of faces with anomalies. We also ask people their explicit biases, and generally people don't think they have explicit biases despite showing robust implicit biases. It turns out that there is zero correlation between people's own judgments about their own biases and the effect size we get on implicit bias. One implication of that is that we are not very good, we're not very good judges of our own bias. And then the other observation that we've replicated is that men tend to have more robust negative implicit biases than women, at least for these kinds of faces. And that may have some implications given that for the most part, it is still the case that men are in positions of hiring people more frequently than women. So it's just something worth keeping in mind. So what happens in our brain when we are looking at these kinds of faces? So this is a study where people are just shown these faces. It's an fMRI study, and all people are doing is when a face shows up, they just make a decision. Do they think this is an image of a man or a woman? So again, there's no valuation. It's just looking at their ability to say, I think I'm looking at a man, I think I'm looking at a woman. And what we find, again, in our visual system, shown in the bottom left, is that there's increased activity to these kinds of anomalous faces compared to typical faces, again, telling us that there's some valuation going on in our occipital cortex. But in some ways, a little more interesting and surprising to us was that if you look at the middle panel, that there was decreased activity in this part of the brain that's in the middle towards the front. This is part of the medial prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate, in which there was decreased neural activity. Now, this turns out to be somewhat interesting because there have been a variety of studies that have shown that this is a part of the brain that gets active when people are put into conditions of empathy. And some people have suggested, there's a group at Princeton that have suggested that this might actually be a biological marker for something to do with dehumanization. And so we're following up on this, and we have probably our most ambitious study to date, which is currently under review. I'm just going to show you one slide of that, in which we followed up on this, on these initial observations. And I won't, it's a complicated design, and given the time limitations, I didn't feel like I could get into it. But just as a teaser, one thing we find is that within the fusiform gyrus bilaterally, this is parts of the brain that are responsive to faces, and the left amygdala, the degree of neural activity it correlates with the effect sizes on people's implicit bias. So the greater that people have demonstrated an implicit bias on the IAT test, this shows up in their neural activity. It also turns out that within the left amygdala, there are certain dispositional characteristics that modulate activity in this specific area. So there's something called the just worlds belief, which is this idea that we all vary in how, what our basic belief is, whether the world is just or not. So some people think bad things happen to bad people, and other people think it's just the luck of the draw. And people fall somewhere along the lines of that. And what we see is that this activity in the left amygdala is modulated by how people respond, what their dispositions are to their basic biases of whether the world is just or not. One other tantalizing finding we have is you always want to know, does this actually have an impact on how people treat each other? So we use some of these games that have been designed in behavioral economics. And in this case, it's a dictator game, which is one way to get a sense of how generous are people if they are going to distribute resources. And what we find is that people who tend to be less pro-social, as indexed by the dictator game, that this pro-sociality index also modulates neural activity in the left amygdala. And so this is our first start to try to look at these kinds of effects and say, how do people's dispositions, like what are people bringing to this? How do individual dispositional differences modulate this kind of these kinds of responses? And does this actually have an impact into behavior. And we're trying to understand whether there are ways that we can mitigate some of these biases. And so while this is being done in the context of facial anomalies, there is a broader question that we are hoping to address, which is broadly, what's the relationship between appearance and morality, or beauty and morality, and especially in the complicated social, political, and racial climate we find ourselves. There may be some broader implications of this kind of research in other domains, which we hope to explore. So as I said, we're thinking about people, places, and things, and I'm going to move on to thinking about places, which is the question of our architectural interiors. Most people in the materially developed world spend about 90% of their time indoors. And this idea that our physical surrounding has an impact on our sense of well-being is, on the one hand, it seems obvious to most people that people care about what their surroundings look like, but it has not been a focus of a great deal of study. So this is going back to Vitruvius, who was a first century Roman soldier and architect. And he actually wrote a 10-volume book on architecture, or a 10-volume treatise on architecture, in which he really laid out the idea that architecture can be thought, the built environment can be thought in these three terms, which is the materials, the strength of the materials, and for what gets used in building, its functionality, and also the aesthetics of the built environment. And arguably, in the first half of the 20th century, the functionality and aesthetics of buildings got conflated, which is that often there was this idea, probably promulgated mostly by the Bauhaus School of Architecture, which got imported to the US. But this idea that the aesthetics of a building is its functionality. The better its function, the more beautiful it is. But that idea is starting to get disconnected in more recent approaches to the design of buildings. I'm going to show you data that is a prologue to the information I really want to share with you. So this was a study that we did some years ago, asking a rather straightforward question, which is that, is our response to the beauty of architectural interiors, does this response use the same kind of reward systems that have been observed in other domains? So with faces, with food, and so on. So a kind of straightforward question. And in this case, we used images that varied based on whether the ceilings were high or low, whether the interiors were rounded or rectilinear, and whether the spaces were open or closed. And in this case, by open, we mean that you can see beyond the space itself. And at the outset, I should point out that a huge limitation of this kind of research, which you might think is on first principles is completely absurd, is that when we do these studies in a scanner, what you have is people lying absolutely still on their back looking at two-dimensional images, which is not at all what the experience of architectural spaces is. So we recognize that limitation. Nonetheless, we have findings that we think turn out to be quite interesting, and we are hoping to find out if those generalize in more ecologically valid settings. So we start out with these images, which were actually selected by architects in Denmark, and ask this basic question about the response to beauty in these spaces. And what we do find, again, is that in parts of ventromedial prefrontal cortex, there is neural activity that varies with how beautiful people find these spaces. And so it's just this was just a simple demonstration to say that our response to architectural interiors capitalizes on the same reward systems as do our experience of pleasure from faces, from food, from drink, and so on. So we came back to those data, as you saw, were published in 2013, which meant we collected them around 2011 or so. So we come back to this. I had a graduate student named Alex Coburn who was getting a PhD in architecture from Cambridge. He came to my lab to do some of his empirical work. And we combed the literature and found that for most studies, whether it's for landscapes, or built environments, that these are the kinds of psychological dimensions that people query. And so we used this, again, in a large online study. In this case, we had close to 800 participants rating these 200 images along these psychological dimensions. And when you do that, on the left, you can see the kind of correlation matrix that you get. Which suggests that certain kinds of people's responses to these dimensions correlate very highly or not as much. That gives you a kind of map of how people think of these, how people rate these kinds of images. So we take this and then use two different kinds of data reduction techniques. One is called a semantic network analysis. And what this does is gives you a spatial display of how these notions, these psychological dimensions, are related to each other. And I can't claim to understand the math behind this kind of network analyses, but network analyses are something that are starting to become, gain prominence in some cognitive studies and neuroscience studies. So Yoed Kennett, who is an expert in this, performed this. And what is interesting for us is that it looks like these dimensions are centered around valence. So the most basic question of, do you feel good or not, right? That's the most basic notion of wellness one can think about. But there seems to be three communities of responses, which we have labeled as coherence. How coherent does an environment appear? Fascination. Are people intrigued by it? Is there a desire to explore the space? And hominess, which is, do you feel comfortable in this space? So we've all had, I'm pretty sure, the experience of being in places like hotel rooms where things are very beautiful, they're very coherent, but it just doesn't feel homey in the way that one feels like they belong there or own that space. We then did a more conventional principal components analysis and basically find the same three components. You can see that coherence explains 40% of the variance and the other two about a quarter of the variance in people's response. And then we take the whole thing, replicate it again in another 400 participants, we get the same thing. And then in some ways, to me, the most interesting thing we ended up doing was going back to the imaging work we did that was published in 2013. And just to be clear, those data were collected in Spain. These response data were collected in the US, right? So very different populations looking at exactly the same images. At the time that we collected those data, we didn't know about these components. And so it's probably as good a double-blind experimental study as you can have, because we didn't know to ask the question about these components at the time the data were collected. The participants certainly didn't know. And yet what we find is that there are, when we go back and remodel the data using these components that we have, we find that within occipital cortex that there is some degree of responsiveness to these components, and that these vary a little bit depending on the context, but again suggest that these are three components that our visual system is recognizing. And these responses were always there in those participants, we just didn't know to ask the question. Again, analogous to, I think, what we were finding with the automaticity of responses to beauty in faces, there is a kind of automaticity response in our brains to various features of our architectural interiors and our response, our psychological response to those kinds of dimensions. So where are we going from this? One thing we want to do is try to understand, do these dimensions actually apply when you're out in real spaces and three-dimensional spaces, which is that we are hoping to explore. It's very hard to collect neural data out in the field, but in the next 5 years, there are hopes that various mobile techniques using EEG or infrared spectroscopy may develop to the point where we can start using this, but at least it gives us a direction in which to go. And finally, I'm working with a architectural firm in Philadelphia called Ewing Cole, where we've been thinking, collaborating with them on how these kinds of neural data and experimental data might inform the design of, in this case, we're looking at places that are designed for people with short-term memory deficits in dementia units. So again, it's a way to try to take some of this very sort of Ivy Towerish sorts of findings and see the extent to which they apply in the wild and the extent to which they apply to actual design of buildings. Okay, so I am now going to turn to the third piece of this talk. I said people, places, and things. And things we can think about in two ways, which is either the design of products or actual artworks. And we're interested in both of those, but I'm going to tell you about a specific study that is also currently under review on artwork. And the basic question there is, what is the nature of being engaged with art, right? That's the basic question. The broader question that we hope to address, which won't be addressed in this specific study, is what is art good for? Right? This is a fundamental question of why do some of us find ourselves preoccupied, whether it's with visual art or music, in a way that we think is valuable, that contributes to our well-being, it contributes to human flourishing. And yet, on the other hand, there's a way in which our society, our culture tends to denigrate arts as expressed by what money we're willing to put into it. So you may recall at the beginning of the pandemic, the Philadelphia, the mayor's administration basically decided to cut funding for arts and culture as one of the first things they did. This is one of the first things that happens in our public school systems when budgets are tight. And so we would like to make a long-term goal is trying to make the case, if it turns out to be true, that arts are really important. But the narrower question right now is, what is the nature of our engagement with art? And to do this, we selected artworks from Jackson Pollock and from Piet Mondrian. And for a specific reason, because there is one hypothesis in neuroaesthetics that part of being engaged with artwork is our entire body somehow is engaged, simulates the experience of the artwork, which suggests that our motor systems contribute to the experience of artwork. And so to test this idea, we specifically chose images that were made by Jackson Pollock and Mondrian. And part of the reason for this is, as many of you know, Pollock is thought of as an action painter. There's a lot of dynamism, a lot of movement in his painting, whereas Mondrian's tend to be quite static. And so this gives us a nice contrast, both in the context of relatively abstract work, of an index in which there is differing degrees of motion, of movement in the paintings. So we take their paintings and we norm them, And we get what you can see is a nicely distributed, a bimodal distribution, where the Mondrians are relatively static. There's a slight overlap, and that the Pollocks are regarded as high in motion value. Now, we decided to test this idea in a group of people with Parkinson's disease. And the idea here, the logic is that if our aesthetic engagement involves our motor systems in an active way, and you have a condition in which motor systems are actually impaired, does it then follow that the aesthetic engagement with artwork will be impaired because of this impairment in someone's motor systems, right? So that's the basic logic. So this was just to give you an example of the artwork. So you can see in the top right, this is Mondrian's Broadway Boogie Woogie. For those of you who might know this, this is his one that is regarded as the most motion in his artwork. But it still is considerably less than what most of Pollock's paintings are. Okay, so going back to the specific study, we tested 43 people with Parkinson's disease, 40 control participants that were age matched. These, just to be very clear, the people with Parkinson's did not have cognitive problems. So we pre-selected for people who had relatively mild Parkinsonism. They had motor symptoms, but they didn't have cognitive symptoms. And we had them look at these paintings and make various kinds of judgments. And what is depicted on the right there is a graphic depiction of the correlation in their judgments, which is that these three valuative judgments, beauty, interest, and liking, are very, very highly correlated in these kinds of judgments. Interest and beauty don't always correlate, just as an aside, but in this case, they correlated quite highly. So what did we find? This is a descriptive graph, and we've done more sort of careful statistical analytic graphs, but I think this depicts the point that I would like to make, which is that on the top, what you're seeing on the top row is how paintings vary by the amount of motion that they were thought to have, and people's judgments of either liking or beauty, which again, as I said, are highly correlated. What we find is that there is a kind of almost a quadratic relationship for normal, for the healthy controls, which is as motion increases, they start to like it, and then it trails off, as you can see. People with Parkinson's have a similar kind of curve, but they never reach the same peak of liking as people with control participants, suggesting that their appreciation of these paintings, when it is dependent on how much motion there is in the painting, is somewhat dampened. Now, you could say that a priori, one could imagine that maybe people with Parkinson's just don't enjoy paintings as much. You could think of a story in which, because they have a dopamine deficient state, and we know dopamine is important in an important component in our reward systems, it could be that people with Parkinson's are just dampened all across. But that turns out not to be the case, because when we look at complexity, the relationship of complexity to people's liking or their judgments of beauty, it turns out that people with Parkinson's are indistinguishable from healthy controls. So the idea is that when we are appreciating artworks, there are a variety of different attributes that contribute to what makes us like artworks. And in this case, what we are finding is that if you look at complexity, in which, again, for these patients in whom we don't think of them as we don't have any evidence that they have cognitive problems, they have no trouble, and their kind of preference is similar to what other people have. but specifically if motion is involved, there is a flattening, a dampening of their ability to enjoy these kinds of paintings. Again, at least broadly consistent with this idea that our motor systems are somehow involved in our appreciation of art. This paper is currently under review, and I will leave you with something that, in the future we should have some more evidence on, which is this broader question of what is art good for? And we are right at the very beginning of a grant that was funded by the Templeton Foundation, which is to ask the question is whether engagement with the arts somehow enhances understanding or advances knowledge. Right? That's a specific proposition that goes under a fancy term in philosophy called aesthetic cognitivism, but that's a proposition that we're hoping to try to test to say, is it the case that engaging with art somehow has the potential to produce a transformational effect on us, with behind that being the broad question is what is art good for? And with that, I will stop and happy to entertain questions.
So if you would like to ask a question, you can use the hand raising option on your screen. On my iPad, there's 3 dots at the top of the screen, and when I hit it, it gives me the ability to raise my hand. And if you're on a computer, I think that option is on the bottom of your screen through the participants button. So please use those.
Warren, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Well, first of all, thank you for a fascinating lecture and fascinating work. I just want to say I feel a special connection to you because I also went to Haverford College, followed by Penn Medicine. So I try to sneak in 2 questions. They're unrelated. The first is, do you think great artists themselves perceive or sense beauty in a different way than non-artists? If you were to do neuroimaging, for example, on, experienced artists, would they look the same as non-artists or not? That's one question. And the second is, do you think a fully embodied cognition approach could ever provide a complete understanding of beauty?
So first question first. We don't actually know the answer to that. And, sometimes when I give talks, especially when I'm talking to students, I point out that this is such a young field that obvious questions remain to be addressed, right? Just because we are so early in the field. To get a little closer to your question, one thing we do know is that expertise makes a difference in how people appreciate art. So eye movement studies have been done in which people who are experts, in this case, experts are not defined necessarily as artists, but people who have had a lot of experience with art, people who might be art critics, people who might be museum curators, people who just are around art a lot, as opposed to someone who is relatively unfamiliar with fine art. We know that experts, the gaze patterns that they have across artworks is different in how they look at artwork. And then we also know that if you ask the question around what categories of art do people like, people with very little exposure to art tend not to like abstract art. And that's where you often get comments like, "Oh, my kid could have done this. I don't know why is this, selling for X million dollars? It doesn't make any kind of sense." So, so some exposure to art certainly makes a difference in how people look at things and how people experience things. And there is at least one study that was actually done in architecture, an fMRI study comparing people's responses to buildings and showing that graduate students who were enrolled in an architectural program responded differently and appreciated buildings more than graduate students who were enrolled in a different program. Again, so I think it's probably consistent with your idea that maybe people who are artists as one category of experts have a different sensibility around even the consumption, the gazing of art.
Mhm.
Now, the second question, I went on too long to keep track of what the second question was.
The second question was, would a fully embodied cognition approach, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think probably not. And when I set up what we refer to as the aesthetic triad, the top of that triad is really around meaning and semantics. And so this idea that that there is a lot of education, a lot of cultural. There's a lot of things in our culture that contribute to what we decide is attractive. So I mean, this partly maybe does go back to Judy's original point, which is that if you take big surveys of the American public right now, most people do very much like Impressionist paintings. But when it first came on the scene 150 years ago, these were regarded as too outrageous. The Paris salons rejected them, and our brains haven't really changed in 150 years. So there is something about the kind of cultural milieu in which we find ourselves that has a very big impact on what our experiences are. And so, I don't think a fully embodied, meaning that a recreation of our sensory motor experiences, if that's what we mean by an embodied experience, would fully account for the way in which we experience artwork.
Thank you. Thank you.
Roseanne Wu, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, yes, thanks for that great talk, very interesting. My question is about the little chart you showed about looking at architecture, hominess, fascination, and coherence. I was wondering, how do those things play in with regard to people's stated preferences for certain elements in architecture? Because, we all seem to like different things, prefer things that are either more warm and welcoming or things that are more kind of coherent, organized, and modern. Just wondering, how stated preferences and likes and dislikes play into that model.
Yeah, we don't know the answer to that. It's a great question. One could imagine that, this is everybody who's ever had a roommate or a housemate has often struggled with this, where some people like things a little neater than others, and what we find comfortable can vary, and this can be sources of great conflict. And probably long-term relationships that succeed negotiate all that stuff pretty early on. But the general point remains is we don't know, for example, if what makes one person react with hominess to a specific space versus another one. I think what I would be willing to say is that whatever contributes to that, to hominess, for one person, which might be slightly different than another person, that hominess is still going to be important for everyone. And I say that by making, by way of analogy to artwork. So for example, or let me take one step back. One thing that I didn't talk about is if you look across people in general, and ask about beauty, people tend to be quite consistent in beauty of faces. They tend to be pretty consistent in the beauty of natural landscapes, not quite as consistent as faces, but pretty close. Least consistent when it comes to artwork. And architectural interiors are somewhere in between artwork and natural landscapes in terms of just the consistency of people's responses. And in some ways, you can think of architecture and interior environments as almost a constructed an artifactual way of reconceiving our natural landscapes, right? So we think it makes sense that this fits in between there. There have been studies in artwork showing that, you know, I might really adore Hopper and you might really like, you know, like, I don't know, Rembrandt, and someone else might really like Pollock, that, you know, so we have these profound differences in which artworks we find ourselves drawn to, but the artworks that really move us, whichever those are, that we tend to have similar neural responses to artworks that move us, right? So here you have a situation where very different stimuli, meaning artwork, can trigger a similar mental state. And once you have the same mental state, the neural response tends to be more similar than different. And my speculation would be that while it might be the case that different configurations of an environment might predispose one person to feel homey and another person to not feel homey, if you have the state of hominess, your neural responses are going to be similar.
Karen, can I have a word?
Yeah, hi, Peter. Yes.
Dr. Chatterjee.
We have one other person as well with their hand raised, if we have time.
Okay. Dr. Chatterjee, I very much enjoyed your talk. Can I ask, on the earlier part where you talked about beauty and how perhaps blemishes, facial blemishes, etc., could diminish the appreciation, is the converse true? What happens if you have a beautiful woman, one and the same one in two photographs, and the one has very attractive jewelry on and the other one does not? Or you also, I suppose you have facial piercing is very common today. And these are relatively simple. Can you enhance, what are features which enhance the appeal of a facial characteristic rather than diminish it?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, as often is the case, we don't know the answer to the question. You know, sometimes people will point out that at certain points in our culture, particularly for icons of Hollywood beauty, for example, a birth market, you know, a beauty market, certain parts of the face seems to enhance people's appreciation of beauty. You know, why is that is something that is not so clear. The other question of whether these marks, you know, what is the role of culture and how we apprehend these kinds of marks, right? So there are certain cultures in which scarification in men can be a sign of manhood, you know, and that probably has all kinds of positive valences associated with it in a way that we don't know. We have tried to collect some data. This is with in collaboration with a psychologist here, Corinne Apicella, who does work in Tanzania with the Hadza tribe, that there's this a nomadic tribe that has had relatively little exposure to Western culture, to try to get a sense of do these findings that we have generalize or not. There's an evolutionary story to be told that maybe it does generalize, that our part of our response to physical beauty evolved as a signal of health, of immunocompetence, and the general ideas that are during the Pleistocene, a major threat to survival was being susceptible to infections, particularly parasites, and parasites typically will deform things, whether it's plants or other animals as well. And so this might be, these kinds of facial anomalies might be a signal kind of a subtle signal for general health. So that's the evolutionary story for why this thing might be built in. But it's also not clear, even if that were true, how much that's modifiable. And as you point out, piercings, for example, certainly, and tattoos. I mean, so I was a med student here in the early 80s, and I remember being explicitly told that, you know, if someone has a tattoo, you got to be careful, they might be a sociopath, right? And I have to say, among the brightest grad students and residents that I interview now have tattoos, right? So that's in a matter of, you know, what is that, 30 years, like how dramatically our apprehension, the judgments we make of character based on a feature like that can change dramatically.
Dr. Chatterjee, if you have more time, I know we have 1 or 2 more questions.
Sure.
Sure, we had Diane Gartner waiting.
Yes, I was interested to know what you see as the larger long-term goal or societal goal of your program.
Well, you know, so this always often comes up, and part of my goal is to try to disabuse people of the notion that aesthetics is something frivolous. That is the biggest, the broadest goal, that it is hugely important. And so if we take each of those 3 domains, you know, this whole question of the relationship between beauty and morality, I think, is something that affects us all the time. There's a good chance that there is a good possibility that a lot of what we see on our streets right now, and sort of quick reflexive reactions that police, for example, happen that police demonstrate based on the way someone looks, that these are kinds of quick value judgments that result in actions that can have all sorts of untoward consequences. And so really understanding this conflation of appearance and morality, I think, is central to much of where we find ourselves right now. With respect to architecture, the relationship of architecture and wellness, how often have you gone into a school or even a doctor's office, and there is nothing about the environment that actually helps you either learn or to feel comforted if you're feeling sick and in distress, right? So this idea that the aesthetics of our built environment and how that can be used as a vehicle, as a tool to enhance human flourishing, depending on what the point of that architectural space is. And with respect to things, I didn't talk about the design of products because we haven't done very much work on that. But going back to art, why do we care about art? Why should we invest in arts and cultural programs in a city like Philadelphia? So, you know, so to answer your question, as I said, the big goal here is to try to disabuse people of the notion that aesthetics is something frivolous, you know, that is something just for the wealthy and people with a lot of leisure, time and money, but this is really central to our lives.
And if you still have time, we have 1 more question.
Yep.
Talia
Okay.
Fishman.
Fishman, right. Thank you. Thank you so much. This was very interesting. As a student of medieval European cultures, I'm aware of the fact that there were very clear programmatic expressions of how aesthetics are supposed to affect the soul. And these are using the physiology of the medieval physiological understandings that are based on ancient ones, and that these had very direct consequences in the construction of, for example, churches and mosques. I'm wondering if there's a historical dimension to the project that you're undertaking that acknowledges the efforts of earlier people to understand the actual physical impact of aesthetic stimuli.
I would love to hear more about that. We're certainly not averse to historic insights into this. I confess to being relatively ignorant of the kind of scholarship you're talking about.
Dr. Chatterjee, I just want to thank you again for just a wonderful, fascinating talk. And I think we would all agree with you that aesthetics is very important and crucial to all of us in all spheres of life. And we're with you. Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Thank you.
Everyone.